Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. It's Carrington Bridges, and on my channel, I like to do a lot of automotive content, as well as talk a little bit about the Bible and modern day events. In 2024, I had the wonderful privilege of accepting the job that I am currently at now. And a part of that job is driving some of the world's most well-engineered, well-built, and most sought-after exotic supercars and sports cars that are on the market today. And it's for that reason why today I'm going to rank the top 5 most fun to drive supercars and sports cars that I was able to drive last year in 2024. This list is solely going to be on how fun to drive these cars are, not about the interior quality or reliability. Coming in at number 5 is the brand new Mercedes AMG GT, the coupe, the 2-door. Now on paper, this vehicle is not as great as the one that it replaced, the first generation AMG GT. It doesn't have a dry sump like the old one did. The weight distribution isn't quite as well balanced. It weighs a lot more, and it's all-wheel drive instead of rear-wheel drive. However, when you get behind the wheel of the new AMG GT, all concerns are laid to rest, because how this car drives is truly one of the best in its class currently right now on the market. For one, it still sounds amazing even though we have all of these modern emissions regulations. It cracks, it pops, and it still sounds visceral, and it's one of those emotional aspects to the drive that you just don't get in electric cars or things like that. 2, the transmission in the new AMG GT is snappy. And Mercedes, as we know, has struggled with transmissions in the past, creating a very engaging transmission to drive. This car hasn't. And I realize this even more comparing a vehicle that has the same motor as the AMG GT, but a little bit of a different transmission. You'll see that later down in the list. So yeah, number 2 of why this car drives so well is the transmission. And number 3, which is the most important really for me, is the rear wheel steer, because how this car darts into corners is really just impeccable. Because one, it weighs a lot. Obviously, we know that it weighs much more than the previous AMG GT. And how it then translates that weight into the turns, it's just mind-boggling. It's the point of engineering, really. They're able to make something that weighs as much as it does to go around a bend in such an athletic and confidence-inspiring way. It's truly amazing. Hats off to Mercedes on that. It turns much faster into a corner than even my Giulia. My Giulia weighs almost 1,000 pounds less. And that just shows you the power of rear wheel steering. Number 4 on my list is the Ferrari 812 GTS, which is pretty much like the 812 Superfast, but the convertible version of it. Now, we're just gonna get the big elephant out of the room. That engine is heavenly, especially with the top down and especially going into a tunnel. I was tasked with putting about 70 miles on the car to reset the car for emissions after it failed. And I was able to take a really nice long drive and get to understand what is this car really? Now, I will say a couple of things. The steering does not feel as tied together as other cars on this list. It's electronic. Number 2, obviously with how long that front bonnet is, there's gonna be some hindrances there. Obviously it does have rear wheel steering like what I was just talking about in the AMG GT. However, the dimensions of the front, you're just gonna have to factor in a little bit, but it doesn't take away from the driving experience. Also, how this transmission is tuned is one of the best DCTs that I've ever experienced. It's quick, but more importantly, it's snappy, because ZF8 transmissions are also quick, but they're not necessarily snappy. How it was tuned in this Ferrari is very emotional, and it keeps you alive, really. It keeps you feeling alive. And the motor just pulls all the way up to the top. It's angry, and that's what you get when you drive it. You really, when you're ringing it out, this car is a car driven well in anger. And thanks to it being a naturally aspirated V12, yes, it can get a little sketchy in the rear. However, you can definitely a lot easier modulate the throttle than you would in, like, for instance, McLaren 750S. 3rd on my list, at no surprise, is the Lamborghini Revuelto. The Lamborghini Revuelto is probably the most approachable 1,000 horsepower car to drive. The ease of driving on this car compared to the Aventador is like night and day. First of all, the visibility is much easier to see. The steering isn't as heavy and labor intensive as the Aventador, which is a plus and a minus. For me personally, I kind of prefer the Aventador steering. However, I see how from an ease of driving, the Revuelto steering is gonna be a lot better as a daily driver. But that engine, like the 812 engine was great, but this one revs all the way to 9,500 RPM. It's just so angry when you drive it. What it feels like at the command of your right foot is the power of the strongest and longest wind that is out there in the world. As opposed to things like a McLaren 750S at the command of your right foot, it feels like you have the power of a huge explosion behind you. And naturally aspirated power doesn't feel the same as forced induction or turbocharged power. Also, the visibility and space on the inside, obviously, as anyone who's read the reviews on the Revuelto, is going to be much more improved over the Aventador. The transmission and how it's tuned, it literally pops on downshifts often. And it's something that's amazing that they're able to still do with all of these modern EU emissions regulations. And I want to keep seeing it because that car is amazing. It's perfection, really. So that's why the Revuelto is number 3 on my list. Number 2 is the Ferrari 488 Pista. Now, we talked about the 812 and how that is great. This is even better, which it doesn't have a naturally aspirated engine. So obviously it's not going to sound as good, but the experience that you get when driving it is really second to one, which you'll see later in the video. But the chassis and how they were able to make a chassis that wasn't a carbon monocoque handle so well and be so composed over any type of surface is a testament to Ferrari's chassis engineering as well as their dampening and how they are able to create a smooth ride when you want it, but also a really confidence-inspiring ride when you want it. The steering on the 488 Pista, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's hydraulic, which you can definitely feel. The steering feel just off center when you're not necessarily moving is still heavy, which is something you're not gonna get in, like, let's say a Huracan with electric steering. Like if you're parked and you try to move the steering wheel, it feels like a video game, and that's why you don't see a Huracan on this list. But the 488 Pista, how it's steered, first of all, that's my first impression of a car, is how it's steered, is amazing. It's one of the best, if not the best, steering car that I've ever felt. How the transmission is tuned is absolutely aggressive and emotional. It's not smooth like a PDK. It jolts you on every upshift and downshift that you pull for. And some people might not like that, but if you're buying a 488 Pista, you're gonna like that because it's already a hardcore track-focused car. And the transmission is one of those things I cannot state enough. I've driven all types of Ferraris. How that transmission is tuned on the 488 Pista is the best transmission that I've ever felt on a Ferrari, period. Now the engine, the V8 twin turbo engine on the 488 Pista is a little bit different to the McLaren V8s, as though the McLarens, you get this huge lump of torque the moment you get into boost. But with the 488, it's a lot more linear, and that's because they also do like boost by gear and things like that. But how it's tuned is definitely much more of a naturally aspirated feel, which makes it a lot more easy to drive and approachable than, let's say, a McLaren. So yeah, number 2, one of the best cars I have ever driven is the 488 Pista. Now, before we get to number 1, we're gonna go over a few honorable mentions. These are cars that I really enjoyed when I experienced them, but obviously they don't compare to some of the higher echelon cars that are out there. Number 1 is the Ferrari Portofino, which sounded amazing for a twin turbocharged V8, and that was something I was very shocked about. And it gave you some of that same flair of the 488 Pista and how it shifted. It's not a smooth DCT, it's emotional, it's engaging. And so that's another reason why I enjoy the Ferrari Portofino. Also, you obviously get that top that goes down so you can experience the open air. And overall, how it steered, how it drove, very impressed with that car. Number 2 of my honorable mentions is the Lamborghini Ultimate, which is a very, very interesting car because I've always loved the Lamborghini Aventador. It's one of my favorite cars that have been ever produced, if not my favorite. And I appreciate where the Aventador came from, but after driving the Revuelto, it just really doesn't compare. It doesn't rev as high. And yes, the shifts are a little bit more brutal, but around town it's just very, very clunky. But I will say that the steering is much better than in the Revuelto. And that's something that I really appreciate. Steering feel is one of the number 1 things that I look for in a car. And so the Aventador had it down. So I will say that the Aventador is number 2 on my honorable mentions. And third on my list of honorable mentions is the AMG powered V8 Vantage. Not the previous generation NA Vantage that you can find for like 40 grand on the market, but the one that's going for around like 70 to 90K. That car is an amazing bargain considering what it is. It has an AMG high-powered V8 engine. It has a ZF 8-speed transmission, which is very reliable and it's on pretty much everything that's on the market today. Those combinations, as well as a very, very capable chassis, is going to provide you a really, really amazing driving experience. The steering is very sharp. It doesn't have the most feel compared to other cars that I've driven, but I can handle that because the interior, for one, is amazing. It's hand built, and overall, it just feels very quality. And number one on my list of the most fun supercars I've gotten to drive in 2024 was absolutely the McLaren 750S, which it's probably number one on my list because I haven't gotten to drive the 765 LT yet. However, how McLaren developed that car is just beyond me. It's absolutely insane. It's a roller coaster that you get to control with your right foot. The explosive power delivery is truly something that I cannot stress enough. Like, NA cars are much more progressive, they're much more approachable, but especially with McLaren's, how they tune their turbocharged cars is, oh my God. It's like you are at the control of a nuclear explosion that's going on right behind you, propelling you forward. That's the best way that I can describe how a McLaren feels to drive. One, the chassis is so amazing. It's so well put together. It's a carbon monocoque chassis, and so even in the rain and you're pushing it, it's going to still feel tied down, glued down to the ground. And that's exactly why McLaren is so great. People don't buy McLarens for the reliability, obviously. They buy them because how they drive. And before I worked at where I work at now, I didn't understand that. I was like, well, you could buy a Lamborghini that looks so much better than a McLaren, or you could buy a Ferrari that has so much better of an interior quality and overall vibe and persona to it. However, how a McLaren drives is just second to none. And that goes down to every bit in their engineering. One thing I want to point out, in sport mode in the 750S, it gives you the biggest explosion on an upshift that I've really ever felt. Yes, the Aventador with the single clutch, it kicks you, but how McLaren's did that with the DCT in sport mode, not track mode, because track mode has what they call the inertia shift, which you don't necessarily feel that shift. However, with sport mode in a 750S, it's like an explosion, a mini explosion is let off right when you change the gears, and it just shoots you forward. It's amazing. I can't explain it without you guys having to drive it. It's really what sold me on the McLaren, because I love an emotional gear change when I am going for like a sports car or any type of exciting car to drive. I need that explosiveness in the gear shift, and that 750S had it. And not to mention, guys, the hydraulic steering feel that you get with the McLarens really is amazing. And I know a lot of people harp on this, but when you drive it, you really do get to experience that, especially when you compare it to like something like a Lamborghini Huracan. So yeah, guys, those are the top 5 most fun to drive supercars, exotic cars, sports cars that I got to drive in 2024. Guys, I'm gonna continue to do reviews on cars that I really, really enjoy. Just give me some time. If you guys are interested, subscribe to this channel because I'm gonna do a lot more automotive content. I have 2 cars that I'm building currently right now. So you guys wanna stay tuned for what's coming in 2025. Anyways, guys, till next time.